The night had fallen heavy over the dry plains of the Arizona Territory, where silence spoke louder than any words. The air smelled of dust and pine, and a thin trail of smoke rose from a lonely campfire near the trading post that sat between two rocky ridges. Folks in the nearby village had already shut their doors, the lanterns dimmed behind shuttered windows, afraid of what the darkness carried. Rumors had been spreading for days that an Apache warrior had been captured, one whose defiance couldn't be broken even with chains and bullets. They said he'd been sold off for bounty, but no one expected what happened next. When the auctioneer's hammer struck against the block earlier that day, the crowd had gone still. The warrior stood tall despite the iron shackles biting into his wrists, his chest bare, his back marked with scars that told a story of battle and pride. His long black hair fell across his shoulders, tangled from days in the desert sun. But his eyes, sharp and cold as flint, never wavered. The sheriff called him dangerous, a fighter who'd killed soldiers, but to the watching villagers he looked more like a man carved from the wild itself. Women glanced away in fear, men spit at the dirt to hide their unease, and then came a voice. Soft, trembling, but steady enough to silence the murmurs. "I'll pay for him," the young woman said. Every head turned toward her. She stood near the back, dressed in worn traveling clothes, her gloved hands clutching a small leather purse. No one knew who she was, only that her face carried both courage and sorrow. The sheriff blinked, almost amused. "You sure you know what you're buying, miss?" he asked, her chin lifted slightly. "Yes, I know," the townsfolk whispered among themselves, calling her foolish, cursed even. No one paid coin for an Apache, not unless they wanted trouble, but the sound of silver spilling onto the table sealed her words. The sheriff counted it slow, his grin fading as he realized she wasn't joking. And when the deal was done, the warrior was led to her wagon, still bound, still silent. Now, under the dim light of the campfire, that same warrior stood before her. His chains had been unlocked, but the marks remained on his wrists. The woman's voice trembled as she spoke. "You paid for me. Now do it," she whispered. The words hung heavy between them. He didn't move, only stared at her through the shifting firelight. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of rain, the horses shuffled nearby, and the sound of distant thunder rolled across the valley. Then slowly he stepped closer. But what he did next wasn't what she expected. Instead of anger or violence, the warrior reached for the worn bandages on her arm, the same ones she'd been hiding since the journey began. Gently, he unwound them, revealing deep bruises and torn skin. Her breath hitched, but he said nothing. His hands, though rough and scarred, were careful, almost reverent, as he tore a strip of cloth from his own garment and began to wrap her wound anew. The flames flickered against his face, revealing an expression that was neither cruel nor cold, but heavy with understanding. "You shouldn't travel alone," he said quietly. His voice rough from silence. She turned away, blinking fast. "I don't need anyone," she muttered. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked toward the dark hills that surrounded them, the same hills where soldiers had once hunted his people. Somewhere out there beyond those ridges was his past. Yet something about this woman's trembling hands made him stay. Maybe it was pity, maybe curiosity, or maybe something else he couldn't name. As the fire dimmed, the woman finally spoke again, her voice low. "I didn't buy you to own you," she said. "I just couldn't let them take you away like that." The warrior's gaze lifted to hers, searching for deceit. But all he saw was exhaustion and truth. "Then why?" he asked. She hesitated. "Because once, someone did the same for me." The silence between them deepened, weighted with something neither could escape. He had been taught that mercy was weakness, that the white man's kindness always came with chains. Yet here she was, offering none of that, only quiet defiance in her eyes, and a tremor in her voice that betrayed how frightened she really was. Hours passed before either of them spoke again. She tried to rest against the wagon's side, but the cold crept in. He noticed her shiver and tossed a blanket her way. She caught it hesitantly, murmuring thanks, and then turned her face toward the fire. But even with her eyes closed, she could feel his presence, watchful, distant, and wild as the land itself. In the small hours of the night, a sharp howl broke the stillness. Wolves. The horses snorted nervously. The woman sat up, alarmed, and the warrior was already on his feet, bow in hand, his senses sharp. "Stay close," he ordered. She hesitated but did as he said. The growls echoed from the edge of the clearing, eyes glinting in the dark. A moment later, one lunged from the shadows. The warrior's arrow flew fast, striking true. The beast fell, and the rest scattered into the hills. When the danger passed, the woman realized her hands were shaking. He turned toward her, and for the first time she saw not a captive but a protector. "You're safe now," he said simply. She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking toward the fallen wolf. "You didn't have to save me." He glanced at her with faint amusement. "You paid for me," he said dryly, echoing her earlier words. "Now I repay the debt." Her lips parted in surprise, but before she could speak, a cold gust swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves, distant yet closing fast. The warrior stiffened instantly. "Riders," he said, his tone shifting. The woman's heart raced. "From the town?" He didn't answer. Instead, he doused the fire with his boot and motioned for her to get into the wagon. "Move," he ordered, grabbing the reins. Within moments, the two were driving into the dark, the wagon wheels cutting through wet earth as thunder rumbled overhead. Behind them, torchlights appeared on the horizon. 4, maybe 5 riders. The sheriff's men. The woman clutched the seat, her breath short. "They're coming for you," she shouted over the wind. "For us," he corrected. The storm broke then, rain pounding down in heavy sheets. The horses struggled through the mud, lightning illuminating the canyon walls ahead. "We'll never make it through there," she cried. He looked at her, eyes fierce even in the downpour. "You trust me?" She hesitated only a second before nodding. "Then hold on." He cracked the reins, steering the wagon straight toward the narrow canyon. The wheels jolted violently, throwing sparks as iron struck stone. Behind them, the riders closed in, shouting through the rain. The warrior turned, raised his bow, and fired. One of the torches dropped, a rider falling with it. The rest hesitated, but not for long. The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. "Who are they?" she gasped. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the wagon beneath a low overhang and stopped. "Quiet," he whispered. They waited in darkness, breathless as the sound of hooves thundered past above them. When it finally faded, the warrior exhaled and climbed down. He looked toward the stormy sky, then back at her. "They'll be back," he said grimly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then what do we do?" He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, rain dripping from his hair. "We run until there's nowhere left to chase us." Lightning flashed again, and in that fleeting light she saw the truth. He wasn't just a warrior running from soldiers. He was a man running from a world that wanted him dead, and somehow she had stepped into his path. As the storm roared around them, he reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing against trembling skin. "You stay with me," he said. "No matter what happens next." She didn't know why she trusted him. Maybe it was the way his voice steadied hers, or the fire that burned behind his calm. But when she met his gaze, she nodded, and somewhere in the darkness, unseen by both, a figure on horseback watched from the ridge above, the sheriff himself, his rifle resting across the saddle. He smiled coldly. "Let them run," he muttered. "By morning we'll have them both." The thunder rolled again and the chase began. The rain had not stopped by morning. It fell in thin gray curtains across the endless valley, washing over the tracks the wagon had left behind. The earth smelled of wet sagebrush and iron, and the world felt both alive and haunted. Beneath a rocky ledge, the Apache warrior crouched near a dying fire, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. Every few moments he glanced toward the woman still asleep beneath the wagon's tarp, her breathing shallow, her face pale from exhaustion. She hadn't spoken much since the night before. He knew fear when he saw it, even if she tried to hide it behind bravery. The storm had carried them far from the town, too far for anyone but soldiers to follow. But he also knew the sheriff wasn't a man who gave up easily. He'd seen that kind before, men who hunted others not for law but for pride. The kind who would chase an Apache across the desert until the bones turned white under the sun. He had been that hunted once, and now it seemed he was again. Only this time someone else was caught in it with him. When she stirred awake, she looked around in confusion, then found his eyes. "Where are we?" she asked softly. "South of the river," he replied. "Near the old trails. We'll keep moving before noon." She nodded slowly, brushing damp hair from her face. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," he said simply. "Not for a woman who freed a prisoner." She fell silent, looking down at her trembling hands. "I didn't think they'd come after me," she murmured. "I thought paying for your release would end it." He studied her for a moment, then asked, "Why did you go there? Why risk yourself?" She hesitated, her voice quiet as she stared into the dying fire. "Because I know what it means to be sold." The words hung in the air, heavy as the damp wind. She didn't look at him when she said it, but he saw the pain behind her eyes. She told him about a time not long ago, when she had been taken from her father's ranch after his death. She had been forced to work under a man who treated her worse than any laborer, locked in a small cabin on the edge of his property, sold off piece by piece to pay debts that weren't hers. One night she ran. She'd been running ever since, never staying long in one place, never trusting anyone enough to tell the truth. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening. "And now," he said finally, "you freed a man who's hunted by the same kind of men." Her eyes lifted to his. Maybe I wanted to see if mercy still meant something. For a while, neither spoke. The fire hissed as rain dripped from the rocks above. Then the warrior stood, tossing the last of the coals into the mud. "Mercy gets you killed out here," he said. She looked away, whispering, "Maybe it's still worth dying for." He turned from her words, pretending not to hear, but they followed him like a ghost. By midday, they were back on the trail, the wagon rolling through a narrow pass lined with red stone. The clouds had begun to thin, letting streaks of sunlight spill through, turning the desert floor into patches of gold. The warrior walked beside the horses, his hand on the reins, scanning the ridges for movement. The woman sat inside the wagon, watching him through the flap. Every step he took was sure and silent, the kind that came from a life lived among danger. She wanted to ask about him, about what he had lost, but she held back. Something in the way he carried himself warned her not to pry. Still, curiosity tugged at her. "You never told me your name," she said after a while. He glanced up briefly. "Names are for people who have homes," he said. "Then what should I call you?" He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Call me nothing," he said, but there was no anger in his tone, only caution. She nodded, understanding more than he expected. The hours passed in silence until the sound of a distant rifle shot echoed through the canyon. The horses reared, the wagon jolted, and the warrior's hand shot up instantly. "Get down," he ordered. She obeyed, crouching low as another shot rang out, this one splintering wood near the wheel. He darted to the side, scanning the cliffs. "There," she pointed, trembling. A figure moved along the ridge, a flash of light from the barrel giving him away. The warrior drew his bow, moving with the precision of someone who'd hunted since boyhood. One arrow, released in silence, flew upward and struck the rifle clean from the man's hands. The sound of it clattering down the slope broke the tension for just a second, but the danger wasn't over. More riders appeared at the canyon's far end. "Sheriff's men," the woman whispered. The warrior's expression hardened. "We move." He climbed onto the wagon and cracked the reins. The horses surged forward, hooves striking sparks on the stone. The canyon narrowed, wind howling through the gap. Behind them, the riders gave chase, their shouts carrying over the echoing cliffs. Bullets kicked up dust around the wheels, one grazing the sideboard near the woman's leg. She gasped, gripping the seat, as the warrior steered the wagon dangerously close to the edge. "Hold on," he shouted. The trail dropped sharply, curving down into a dry riverbed below. The wagon skidded, nearly toppling, but he managed to keep it upright, guiding it into the basin. The riders above struggled to follow, their horses slipping on the loose rock. By the time they reached the bottom, the wagon had vanished behind a curtain of dust. When the noise finally faded, the woman turned to him, her face pale. "They'll find us again," he nodded. "They always do, but why? Why won't they stop?" He slowed the horses, eyes fixed ahead. "Because the sheriff doesn't chase men," he said. "He chases trophies." She didn't understand at first, but when she saw the look in his eyes, it made sense. To men like the sheriff, capturing an Apache warrior alive was worth more than gold. It meant power, fame, and the respect of those who feared the tribes. And killing him, well, that was just easier. As the sun began to set, they reached an old homestead long abandoned. The roof sagged, the windows broken, but it offered shelter. The warrior checked every corner before letting her step inside. Dust clung to everything, and a faded Bible lay open on a wooden table, its pages curled from years of neglect. She brushed her fingers across it. "Someone once prayed here," she said softly. "Not anymore," he replied. That night, as the desert cooled, they sat in silence again. The woman stared into the flickering lantern, her mind tangled with questions. "You said mercy gets you killed," she whispered finally. "But you saved me anyway, twice." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't kill without reason," he said. "Then what reason do you live by?" For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Once I had a family. Soldiers came to our camp before dawn. My father fought, my mother. She tried to run with my little brother. Only I lived." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, the motion stiff. "Don't be. The world doesn't stop for sorrow." Her voice trembled. "Maybe it should." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the boards. He stood and went to check the door. "We leave before first light," he said. She nodded, but sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made her flinch. The groan of wood, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of his footsteps outside. When she finally drifted off, it was to the sound of him whispering something in his own tongue. A prayer, maybe, carried softly by the wind. By dawn, they were back on the move. The landscape changed as they rode deeper south. Wider skies, fewer trails, the kind of wilderness only those born to it could understand. The woman watched him from the seat beside her, his posture calm but his eyes always searching. "You think they'll catch us?" she asked. He glanced toward the horizon. "Not if I find what I'm looking for first." "And what's that?" He didn't answer right away. Then, as the sun rose behind them, painting the sky in red and gold, he said, "A place where no man sells another." The words hung in the morning air, simple yet heavy. She didn't know if such a place existed, but as she looked ahead, toward the endless, untamed land, she wanted to believe it might. But somewhere far behind them, in the sheriff's office back in town, a new bounty notice was being nailed to the post. It bore 2 sketches this time, one of the Apache warrior and one of the woman who'd freed him. The ink was still fresh when the sheriff spoke to his men. "Alive if possible," he said coldly, "but dead will do." And out there on the open trail, the hunted and the free rode deeper into the wild, unaware that their story was just beginning, and that by saving each other, they had set fire to the law of the land itself. The sun burned low and red over the horizon as they rode deeper into the barren stretch of land few dared to cross. Dust hung in the air behind the wagon, and every rattle of the wooden wheels echoed like a warning in the stillness. The Apache warrior kept his eyes fixed on the trail, his hand resting near the bough beside him, while the woman sat quietly, clutching the small cross hanging from her neck. Neither spoke, but both knew what weighed between them: danger, trust, and a secret neither had yet revealed. By the 3rd day, the land began to change. Dry mesas gave way to rolling plains dotted with scrub oak and the faint smell of water. They stopped by a shallow creek where the horses drank greedily, and the woman knelt beside the stream to wash her hands. Her reflection trembled on the surface as she looked at her own face. Dust-streaked, weary, but alive. She thought of the bounty posters she knew must now bear her likeness. Once she had dreamed of peace and a small home somewhere quiet, but now that dream was fading behind her faster than the wagon's tracks. The warrior, meanwhile, was thinking of the riders behind them. He could read the land like a book, the hoofprints in the dirt, the faint ashes of campfires days old. Someone was still following. He didn't tell her, not yet. Fear had its own weight and she already carried enough. But when he looked up at the setting sun, he could see a distant glint, metal catching the light on a far ridge. The sheriff's men weren't far. That evening, as they camped among low hills, the woman spoke for the first time in hours. "You could leave me," she said softly. "You'd move faster alone." He shook his head. "If I left you, you'd be caught before morning. Then you're risking your life for mine." He turned to face her, the firelight catching the planes of his face. "You gave me my life," he said. "It's only fair I give it back." She wanted to believe his words, but deep down she feared what would happen if the sheriff caught them both. "If they take us," she whispered, "they won't show mercy." He looked into the flames, eyes distant. "Then we make sure they don't." That night neither slept. Coyotes cried in the distance, and each sound made her tighten the blanket around her shoulders. He sat awake, watching the darkness. The wind carried faint echoes, hooves perhaps, or just the restless whisper of the land. By dawn they moved again, heading toward a range of low mountains that rose like broken teeth against the pale sky. The warrior guided the horses along a narrow trail hidden by rock and brush. He knew this path. His people once traveled it when soldiers burned their villages and drove them into exile. There were caves ahead, safe places known only to those who remembered the old ways. As they climbed, the woman grew pale. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wagon's side, and he noticed the sweat on her brow. When they stopped, she nearly collapsed to the ground. "You're ill," he said, kneeling beside her. It's nothing, she murmured, but her voice was weak. I just need rest. He touched her forehead. It burned with fever. Without another word, he lifted her gently and carried her toward a shaded hollow beneath a cliff. She tried to protest, but her strength failed. He laid her down on his blanket and went to fetch water. When he returned, he crushed herbs from a small pouch tied to his belt and mixed them into the water. Drink, he said firmly. She hesitated, then obeyed. The bitterness made her grimace, but she drank until the cup was empty. What is it? She asked faintly. Medicine from my people, he said. It will help. Her eyes softened. You still carry your ways with you. He looked away. They are all I have left. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, he sat nearby watching over her. He thought of his tribe, scattered and silent, their songs lost to the wind. He remembered his father's words. A man is not free until he protects what cannot defend itself. Maybe that was why he hadn't left her behind. Maybe this woman, fragile yet fierce, reminded him of something worth saving. By evening, her fever broke. When she woke, he was gone. Panic seized her chest until she heard the sound of his footsteps returning. He carried a rabbit he'd caught, its fur damp from the rain. She sat up slowly, relief and fear mixing in her chest. You shouldn't wander alone, she said. He glanced at her. I wasn't alone, he said simply. The land walks with me. She smiled faintly despite her exhaustion. You sound like my father, she whispered. He used to say the same before he died. He looked at her curiously. He was a rancher? She nodded. A good one. He treated everyone fair, but when the war came, men stopped caring about fair. Her voice caught as she continued. One night, soldiers came through. They said they were looking for Apaches hiding near the property. They burned everything, even the barn. My father tried to stop them. They shot him. The warrior's jaw tightened. The same men who call themselves protectors, he muttered. She nodded, eyes wet but hard. That's why I couldn't stand there and watch them sell you like an animal. Silence settled again, thick as smoke. He prepared the fire and cooked the rabbit, dividing it evenly. As they ate, he said quietly, You don't owe me anything. She met his gaze. Maybe not, but I need to believe some things are still worth saving. After the meal, the wind shifted. Far off, a faint echo of gunfire carried through the valley. Both froze. He stood instantly scanning the ridge. They're close, he said. Too close. How far? She whispered. Half a day, maybe less. She clutched her coat tighter. Then we should move. He shook his head. No, they'll expect us on the trail. We go higher, through the rocks. Harder for the horses, but safer. As they packed quickly, she noticed him pause, staring toward the horizon. What is it? She asked. He frowned. Smoke, more than one fire. The soldiers might be sweeping the area. She followed his gaze, heart sinking. They're burning people out. They've done it before, he said grimly. They'll do it again. When they set off, the terrain turned harsher. Loose stones slipped under the horses' hooves, and the air thinned as they climbed. Each mile tested their will. By dusk, they reached a high plateau overlooking miles of wilderness. Below, in the fading light, they could see riders moving like ants across the open land. They've split up, he said, searching in lines. She sat down heavily on the rock beside him. We can't keep running forever, he didn't answer. Instead, he took something from his pouch, a carved pendant of bone and stone shaped like a bird. He placed it in her hand. What is this? She asked softly. Symbol of protection, he said. My mother gave it to me before the soldiers came. It's all I have left of her. She stared at it, then looked up at him. You should keep it, he shook his head. It's yours now. The land listens to those who carry its spirit. Her fingers closed around it, the weight small but comforting. And what about you? She asked. He looked out across the valley where lightning flickered in the distance. Me? He said. I don't need protection. I need revenge. The words hit her like a blow. Against who? The sheriff, he said quietly. He led the soldiers who killed my people. Her breath caught. You're saying he was there? He nodded. Years ago, when they burned our camp. I was a child then. I remember his voice, his gun, his smile. She trembled. Then he's not just chasing you. He's hunting to finish what he started. He turned to her, his face set with calm fury. He doesn't know I remember. But he will. She looked down at the pendant, realizing that her fate was now bound to his not just by mercy, but by vengeance. The law had turned against them both. As darkness fell, They built a small fire under the rocks, hidden from sight. The warrior kept watch while she slept, his thoughts restless. In the distance, torches glimmered faintly along the ridges, the sheriff's men closing in. And far below, among the riders, the sheriff raised a spyglass toward the plateau, his cold smile returning as he spotted a flicker of light against the stone. "Found you," he murmured. "Let's see how far mercy carries you this time." Above, unaware that they'd been seen, the woman stirred in her sleep, clutching the pendant. The warrior's eyes stayed fixed on the darkness, waiting for dawn. The hour when hunters and hunted meet in silence before the storm breaks. The night was darker than any they had faced before. Clouds hung low over the desert sky, heavy with the promise of another storm. The wind howled through the cliffs, whispering like restless spirits. The Apache warrior stood on the edge of the plateau, his bow in hand, eyes fixed on the faint glow of torches below. The riders were closer now. He could hear their shouts carried on the wind, the sound of horses tearing through the brush. The woman sat by the small fire behind him, clutching the carved pendant he had given her, her face pale in the flickering light. She knew something was coming, something they couldn't outrun this time. He turned toward her, his expression steady but grim. "We move before dawn," he said. She looked up, startled. "But they're already close. We'll be seen." "Then we move through the rain," he replied. "They can't track what the sky washes away." Her hands trembled as she packed what little they had left. The wagon had been abandoned 2 days before when the trail grew too steep. Everything now depended on the horses, and on luck, if such a thing still existed for people like them. When the storm broke, it came without warning. Rain slashed down in sheets, lightning splitting the horizon in blinding flashes. The warrior led the horses across the narrow ridge, guiding her with a firm hand. The ground turned slick, the rock sharp and loose underfoot. Each step was a battle. More than once she nearly slipped, and each time his arm shot out to catch her before she fell. "Keep your eyes forward," he said over the thunder. "Don't look down," but she did. And when she saw how far the canyon fell below, black and endless, her heart froze. "We can't do this," she whispered. "We already are," he said simply. By dawn, they reached a hidden valley between the cliffs. The rain had stopped, leaving mist hanging low over the ground. The horses were exhausted, foam streaking their flanks. The woman sank to her knees beside a rock, her breath coming in short gasps. He watched her for a long moment, then knelt beside her. "You can rest for a while," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes wide with fear and fatigue. "You said he killed your family. If he finds you, he'll do the same to us." He nodded slowly. "That's why I can't run anymore," her voice cracked. "You mean to face him?" "Yes," he said. "But not until you're safe." "Safe?" She echoed bitterly. "There's no safe place left. Not for me. Not for you," he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The land itself had turned against them. The sheriff's men would not stop, not until both of their bodies were hanging from the town square. He stood and began gathering wood, though his eyes kept drifting to the horizon. As the morning light grew, he found the first sign of what he feared. Hoof prints in the wet earth, still fresh. The rain hadn't hidden everything. He crouched to study them, his pulse steady but his mind racing. "They've split into groups," he murmured. "Some went east. The rest are circling around." She rose to her feet, clutching her shawl. "Then we have no way out." "There's always a way," he said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure if he believed it. They rode deeper into the valley, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each turn. At the far end, a river cut through the rock, a roaring, churning line of white foam. It wasn't wide, but it was fast and deep, swollen from the storm. She stared at it in disbelief. "We can't cross that." He dismounted, testing the current with a branch. "We don't have a choice. They'll be here within the hour." She shook her head, fear flooding her voice. "We'll drown." He met her eyes, firm and calm. "Then hold on to me." The horses plunged into the current, hooves striking against hidden stones. The water surged against them, pulling hard. The woman clung to him, gasping as icy spray hit her face. For a moment it seemed the river would take them both, but with a final push, they broke through to the opposite side, stumbling onto the muddy shore. When they turned, the sound of shouting echoed faintly from across the canyon. The sheriff's men had found their trail. They pressed on, moving through the trees until the sun began to fall again. The sky turned red, and for a brief moment the world looked peaceful, like the war between them and the rest of the world didn't exist. She looked at him, seeing how the fading light caught in his long black hair, how his expression stayed calm even when everything around them burned with uncertainty. "Why are you so quiet?" she asked softly. He looked at her with that same unreadable calm. "Because when you speak too much of fear," he said, "it grows." She smiled faintly. "And if you don't speak of it? Then it stays where it belongs." They set up camp beneath an overhang of stone. He built a small fire that barely gave light, careful not to let the smoke rise too high. The woman sat close, shivering from the wet and cold. She had long stopped pretending she wasn't afraid. He noticed her trembling hands and handed her his blanket without a word. When she looked up, she found him staring at the fire, lost in thought. "You could still leave," she said quietly. "If they take me, they might stop." He turned his gaze toward her, eyes dark and steady. "You don't know men like him. He'd burn the whole desert just to see me hang." She bit her lip. "Then why not end it now? Why keep running?" His answer was low, almost a whisper. "Because he needs to see what he made." She didn't understand at first, but the way he said it sent a chill through her. The fire cracked softly between them, and for a long while there was only the sound of wind moving through the canyon. By the time sleep found her, he was gone again, standing watch near the edge of the cliff. Below he could see the distant flicker of torches, tiny points of light creeping closer through the darkness. He counted at least 6 riders, one of them holding a lantern higher than the rest. Even from that distance he knew who it was. The sheriff. The warrior's hand tightened on his knife. For years he had dreamed of this moment, of facing the man who had taken everything from him. But now, with the woman's life tied to his, the dream had turned into something else. He wasn't sure if it was vengeance or survival anymore. At dawn, the sound of gunfire shattered the silence. A bullet struck the rock near their camp, spraying shards into the air. The woman jolted awake with a cry. "They found us," she gasped. "Stay low," he ordered, pulling her behind a boulder. Another shot rang out, then another. He peeked around the edge, spotting the riders spreading out below. "They're trying to pin us in. What do we do?" He drew his bow and fired. The arrow whistled through the air, striking one rider cleanly and sending him tumbling from his horse. "We make them come to us," he said. The fight grew closer with every heartbeat. Gunfire echoed off the cliffs, horses screaming in panic. The woman covered her ears, shaking. "You can't win against all of them." "Maybe not," he said, "but I can make them bleed for every step." Through the smoke and chaos she caught sight of movement, the sheriff dismounting, his coat whipping in the wind. He was older than she remembered from town, but his eyes burned with the same cold certainty. "Bring him in alive," he shouted. "The woman, too!" She froze. The sound of his voice tore through her chest. He wasn't chasing for justice. He was chasing for pride. The warrior looked at her. "You need to go now. I won't leave you." He took her hand briefly, his grip firm but gentle. "Then don't. But if I fall, you keep riding." Before she could speak, another bullet struck the ground inches from her feet. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder. He rose from cover, firing another arrow that struck true, then vanished behind the rocks again. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder. Then came the sheriff's voice again, louder now. "You can't hide forever, boy. You'll hang at sunrise, just like your people should have." The words cut through the rain like a knife. The warrior's breath stilled. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped out from behind the rock, bow drawn, his silhouette framed against the storm-lit sky. The sheriff raised his rifle slowly, the two men facing each other across the burning remains of the desert brush. The woman called out, her voice breaking, "Don't, please don't." Neither man moved. The wind howled between them, lightning flashing once more. And in that charged silence, every choice, their pasts, their pain, their defiance, hung in the air, waiting for the next heartbeat to decide what lived and what died. The rain returned just as thunder cracked above the canyon, shaking the cliffs like the growl of something ancient. The Apache warrior stood unmoving, his bow aimed steady, his breath even. Across from him, the sheriff's rifle glinted in the lightning's flash. For a long heartbeat, neither man spoke. The storm howled between them, the woman's frightened voice fading into the roar of wind and rain. Then the sheriff stepped forward, mud splashing under his boots. "You think this ends with you?" he called out. "You're one man. I've hunted your kind since before you learned to hold that bow." The warrior didn't flinch. His voice was low, calm and clear. "Then maybe it's time you stopped hunting." The next flash of lightning came with sound, the twang of a bowstring and the crack of a rifle. Both men fired at once. The sheriff staggered, his gun slipping from his hand as he fell to one knee, clutching his shoulder. The warrior dropped behind the rocks, the arrow gone from his bow, his chest heaving. For a moment, nothing but the sound of rain and horses filled the air. The woman crawled forward from her cover, trembling. "Stop!" she cried. "Enough!" Her voice echoed through the canyon, sharp and desperate. The sheriff raised his head, blood running down his sleeve. His eyes were full of fury and pride that refused to die. "He'll hang," he spat. "Even if I die here, they'll come for him. For both of you." The warrior stepped from the shadows, walking slowly toward the fallen man. His movements were steady, deliberate. Each step splashed through the rain-soaked earth. When he reached the sheriff, he stood over him in silence. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his sidearm, but the warrior kicked it away, sending it spinning into the mud. "You killed my father," the warrior said quietly. "You burned our home and you called it justice." The sheriff looked up through the rain, his expression hard. "It was the law." "No," the warrior said. "It was hatred." For a long moment it seemed he would strike. The knife in his hand gleamed faintly. The woman's heart pounded. She could barely breathe, but instead of blood, there came only silence. Slowly, he dropped the knife to the ground. "If I kill you," he said, "then I become what you made me." The sheriff's mouth opened, but no words came. The warrior turned and walked away, his steps heavy, his shoulders trembling, not from weakness, but from restraint. When the woman reached him, she grabbed his arm. "You spared him," she whispered. He nodded. "Because he already lost." Behind them, the sheriff struggled to rise, clutching his wound. He stumbled back toward his horse, glaring after them. "You'll never find peace," he shouted hoarsely. "Not out here, not anywhere." The warrior turned only once. "Peace isn't found," he said. "It's made." By the time the sun rose, the storm had passed and the valley lay still again. The sheriff's men were gone, either scattered or dead. The woman and the warrior stood by the riverbank, their faces lit by the pale morning light. The air smelled clean, fresh after the storm. She looked across the water where the bodies of two fallen riders lay half buried in mud. "Do you think he'll come after us again?" she asked. The warrior shook his head. "He'll tell them I'm dead," he said. "He won't want the story told otherwise. His pride won't let it." She exhaled, her breath shaking. "Then what happens now?" He looked toward the horizon where the desert met the mountains, endless and untamed. "You go east," he said. "There's a settlement beyond the river. They won't ask questions. And you?" "I go home," he said softly, her eyes filled with confusion. "Home? You said it was gone." He looked out at the wild land around them. "The land remembers," he said. "If I rebuild it, it becomes home again." For a while they stood in silence, the weight of their journey heavy between them. She wanted to speak, to tell him to stay, to thank him, but no words seemed enough. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the carved pendant. It had dried from the rain, the smooth surface glinting faintly in the light. "This belongs with you," she said, pressing it into his hand. He shook his head. "It belongs with whoever still believes in mercy." She looked down at it, her throat tightening. "Then maybe it belongs with both of us." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen from him since they met. "Maybe it does." They parted when the sun climbed higher. She crossed the river, the sound of water fading behind her. Every few steps she looked back, watching him grow smaller against the landscape until he disappeared into the mist. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she knew one thing. She owed him her life, and perhaps something greater than that. Days later, she reached the small settlement he'd spoken of. The townsfolk were wary at first, their eyes full of questions she didn't answer. She found work at the small clinic near the church, tending to travelers and wounded ranchers. Word reached now and then of bounty hunters, of burned camps, of men who swore they'd once chased a ghost through the desert but never found him. She kept her head low, her name quiet, and prayed the past would stay buried beneath the sand. But sometimes, at dusk, when the light turned gold and the wind carried the scent of rain, she would walk to the edge of town and stare toward the distant hills. And in her mind she saw him there, strong, silent, part of the earth itself. The Apache warrior, somewhere far from the towns and their laws, rebuilt what had been taken. He gathered stone, mended the broken shelters, and planted seeds near the creek where his tribe once lived. He carved new patterns into the old wood, songs of memory and loss. And at night he sat by the fire, listening to the wind speak in the voices of those who came before him. He was no longer hunted, but he was not at peace either. Peace, he learned, wasn't quiet. It was the strength to keep rebuilding even after the fires. Weeks passed before he found the small object left behind in his pouch, the pendant's twin half. She had broken it before giving it back, keeping one part for herself. He held it in his hand, smiling faintly. Maybe she was alive somewhere under the same sky, remembering too. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he heard the distant sound of hooves. A rider approached slowly, cautious and alone. His hand moved instinctively toward his bow, but then he stopped. The figure dismounted, small against the setting light. A woman. Her clothes were different now, her hair tied back, but he knew her at once. She walked toward him, eyes glistening in the fading light. "You said you'd rebuild," she said softly. "I did," he replied. "And you found me." "I wasn't looking for you," she said with a faint smile. "Not really. I just kept walking where it felt right." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then maybe that's what it means to find home." She stepped closer, and they stood together, silent, watching the land stretch out before them. The same land that had tested, broken, and remade them both. The scars remained, but so did the light. When the wind rose again, carrying the soft scent of pine and rain, she took his hand without words. There were no more soldiers, no more lawmen, no more running. Just two souls who had survived what the world tried to erase. In that quiet, the fire crackled, and the land seemed to breathe again. The old pain still lingered, but now it shared space with something stronger, hope. Far behind them, in a town that had already forgotten their names, the sheriff sat in his office, his wounded arm wrapped tight. He stared at the empty wanted poster on his wall and thought of the man who had spared him. His hand trembled as he poured another drink. The law, he realized, wasn't about justice. It was about men deciding who deserved to live. And for the first time in years, he wished he could take it all back. The story spread quietly, told around campfires and among riders who crossed the desert at night. Some said the Apache warrior and the woman built a new life together, tending to the land and those who wandered lost. Others said they disappeared into the mountains, becoming part of the stories whispered by the wind. But those who had seen them even once swore that in the soft light of dawn, when the sky turned red and the world was still, you could glimpse them walking side by side along the horizon, a warrior and the woman who freed him, living proof that mercy, once given, could change even the cruelest land. And though time carried them far beyond the memory of the village, their story stayed alive in the hearts of those who heard it. A reminder that even in the harshest corner of the old American frontier, kindness could outlast hatred and love, quiet and steady, could rise from the ashes of vengeance.